Hey guys, just going to go over some first impressions from Opus 14. I'm not going to hit every single card or like in-depth review of the entire set, but I will. I think it's about a third of the set. I'll be talking about the cards that I find interesting or good or something worth talking about. First, I'll quickly want to recap my opinion of Opus 13 and how I feel about Opus 13 in the end. So first thing, I think the best decks are absolutely definitely Sophie and Loop for sure, and with Icewind and Fire, Mono Fire, various versions, not far behind at all. It may seem biased putting Loop up there, but I absolutely, I promise it's not biased. I legitimately believe that, and I will defend that. But obviously also Sophie, which is insanely good, insanely universally solid. And then, yeah, Icewind I really like after playing with it quite a bit now myself. I actually really enjoy the stuff it can do. And Monofire is it just has so many good cards and different angles that are all solid. So, as for other random stuff, whoops, I probably shouldn't have that there. Yep. Just other random decks, stuff like Water Lightning, FFT, Cloud Combo, Fire Lightning or EX heavy decks, Mannequins, Dragoons, Golbers, and Cadets, like all various archetypes that are actually like pretty decent, but they're just maybe not quite as good as the other good decks that maybe not as consistent or reliable or have some weaknesses. But things like that. And the reason I bring up all this is because when a new set comes out, the stuff for this new stuff to be good, it has to either improve what's already good or be better than what's already good. So this is kind of like a baseline of what you need to consider when you're evaluating the new cards. But anyway, I'll go straight to it. First card is, I better actually turn that on, Ifrita, which is exactly what the other Ifrita needed. It provides a fourth good name with a very powerful EX. So before there were only two good Ifrits, the 1 cost and the 3 cost that deals 8k. Now there's a third one which also plays right into the Ifrita that has a large payoff for having lots of Ifrits. You might need Mitsuki and Seituna to hit the good numbers with it, because 7k is not a lot, but Terra might be enough, and so I think that rounds out the package nicely, and that could be a deck worth exploring. And like I said, the EX is actually very, very solid, kill a thing and get a search. Remora is basically the only other card that's been able to do that. Illua is finally another name for Shoal, obviously. Fortunately, it is late enough in the game that the power creep has pushed Illua into like a good place. She's no longer the crazy universal threat she once was. Shoal is no longer the most insane game-winning effect, but obviously still good, so that's something to keep in mind. As a card by itself, a 4-cost haste that kills a 9k is actually quite a solid base case, and it is unlikely to survive after that, because it's quite weak, obviously, but it is very efficient to kill things again. Also worth noting that this can trigger Magissa indefinitely. Like, while it's on the field, it can at will trigger your Magissa by dealing at 6k. So that's something to keep in mind too. It's also the first actual good 1-cost fire forward, so Zand is actually potentially playable now, which is cool because there's the backup, which is a good backup with a nice sort of, later on surge effect once you have the fuel for your Zand. So that's something to keep in mind too. This Primal Ifrit, which is not actually an Ifrit, but its name starts with Ifrit. He is a very powerful consolidator, and you can basically just watch my spoiler video about Rain to kind of explain that whole thing and all the idea of multiple damage packets and everything around that. So I won't go through it all again. But that effect of increased damage of the damage that your things do, especially the fact that it does summons as well, that actually has a lot more mileage than it may look like at first. And as long as you can get the value out of the entry, then that's like a pretty solid thing to have lying around. Now, the first crazy insane card, Garland. So this card is one with too much text syndrome. That line of protection that can't take damage from some abilities, is insanely powerful. I cannot stress how far that raises a forward's power level compared to one that doesn't have that line. Especially in this case, when it's combined with 2 generator effects. Even with just 1 generator effect, that protection is insane. But this has 2. And one of them is neutral, and one of them is removal. And so the toss-up between neutral and like non-neutral, which is usually removal, is one of the main things to consider when you're putting cards in your deck. You can't just have a deck full of removal, because then you can't do anything if your opponent doesn't have forwards. You can't have a deck full of neutral cards, because then you can't actually deal with anything. So cards that can do both are incredibly valuable, and they tend towards there's no reason not to play it, and in most cases it's worth playing to the field. So on top of all that, this card is also 4-cost, which is one of the hardest costs to remove. It probably is the hardest cost to remove. So it's basically everything a forward could want, and it's all printed on this card. And to top it off, it's the missing half of Gawain. So that turns Gawain from like a meh card into quite a good card. And also this special is so good that it actually wouldn't be bad to play extra copies of Garland just to keep your search count for Gawain up. And it's also crazy that the draw is not once per turn. So they seem to have been on the ball with most things recently, adding once per turn to the sort of effects that could be, easily repeatable. For some reason it's not here though. Maybe because it's a fire card and they are crazy with fire cards recently. And this one is actually pretty easy to trigger, like multiple times even. So in particular, Ursula loves this, especially if you have 2 of the 3-cost monk, which basically lets you activate her ability an indefinite number of times for 1 CP each, effectively. But even without that, dream scenario, still just having an Ursula with backups is already really good. Having the draw to refuel off of it and, basically negate the drawback of the actually sacrificing stuff is pretty crazy. And then, just in general, this card is very solid. I expect to see a lot of it. Now then, this card. So this came out of absolutely nowhere. To put it quite succinctly, in the words of Zach Paisley, why is there a boss card in the actual game? That's a reference to the boss Cloud of Darkness, which is very, very similar to this. The fact that it's not dark either, so that's obviously relevant. It's 3-cost fire forward. That happens to be searchable by Magissa. This is a neutral. It's another card that is basically always worth playing. There's, basically its only weakness is Cuchulainn, or instant speed removal when it enters. Those are basically the only 2 ways to make this card not really good. Fire is already the only element left with like enough competitive generic cards, so it doesn't need more of these, but here we are. And I want to point out that the cards you get off this are deferred, so that means that you effectively have them, but they don't contribute to your hand size, which means you can effectively hold more than 5 cards, which is actually quite a relevant advantage. When I say you have them, obviously you can't access them while they're removed, but this will die at some point. If it doesn't die, you're going to win the game. So, outside of like Cuchulainn, like I mentioned earlier. But obviously your opponent can see those cards that are removed, so they can see those cards that are going to add to your hand, but that's not a big deal when they can't see your entire hand. Mainly because, in this game, cards are CP, and so just the CP advantage you get from having all those cards, the knowledge they have isn't really relevant because they can't see your entire hand. This card came out of nowhere and is really crazy, and I don't know why it's in fire of all elements, so expect to see that quite a bit too. Susano, Lord of the Revel, another card that I have no idea what it's doing in the game or why they would release it. So I just finished talking about 2 competitive generic fire cards, and now we have a third. For the record, most elements get 0 in the most recent sets, maybe 1. So far in this set, fire has 3. And this also grants fire something else it couldn't do before. Well, it could kind of do, but it gives it a much better way to do it. So Philia was already a one card board clearing fire that it shouldn't have had anyway. But at least that card was high cost and had the drawback of being uncastable at 6 damage. This card is a whole card cheaper. It's 6, not 8. It's always castable, and for some reason it removes them instead of sending the break zone, which is actually a super relevant advantage over board clears that don't do that, which is most of them. It's one of the reasons Jan Toto has been so universal. I mean, not the only, obviously, but that is a super relevant advantage of Jan Toto. And on top of that, it has haste for basically no reason. So you also get a free damage, and it has perfect synergy with Garland. So not only he survives the clear, but also you get to draw a card off the backup that you sacrifice, as if these 2 cards weren't good enough already on their own. They for some reason, even though Fire already had the best generic cards, they are still pushing it really hard, which is interesting, but whatever, it is what it is. And on that note, we come to Samurai, just to add salt in the wounds. So Fire also got something else it's wanted for a while, and that's another good Samurai. So it can keep the count up for Tenzin without having to play garbage like Hien, although because this card's payoff is quite solid for having enough Samurais, you maybe do just play Hien and Gosetsu anyway, just to keep the count up for this effect. And for some reason, the effect is crazy good. This is on a standard unit, no less. One of Samurai's weaknesses before was that without the Samurais already in play, you had to cast a non-Samurai, like Rain or Ranjit or something, for on-demand removal, which still didn't create Samurai presence for your Cyan or whatever. But now you can do that. You can use, targeted removal, on-demand removal without board presence already, and it generates the Samurai board presence that you want for Cyan. And it's a standard unit, so you can do it multiple times, even if your opponent leaves it on the field. Also, most of the time it's going to be a 3 cost 9k Brave too, which is, stat sticks are not amazing, but stat stick with such a relevant effect, and the fact that it's, Samurai for all the Samurai synergies is crazy. Really confused as to where they're going with this, but there's that. This card, finally a card I can talk about that's not crazy good. I already gave my opinion on whether it was spoiled, but I'll just reiterate that the card is basically a 5-cost backup that gains the enter and leave field effect of the forward you use with it. That's pretty much what it boils down to. So it's cute, but as I talked about in my Hojo spoiler, being a named combo backup with no sacrifice effect severely hurts its playability, and it's in such a contested deck slot. It's also... even the forwards that seem really good with that are maybe not quite as good as you would think, just because it already costs effectively 5. That's quite a bit to pay. The fact that it has to be that it's only usable as a combo, basically, it's too, basically a little bit too ambitious most of the time. I mean, there will be situations where it will be good, but they are far enough apart. Like, it'll happen not often enough that you actually probably want this in a competitive deck, especially when there are so many other good options for fire decks. So I don't expect it to stick around as a competitive card at all, but I do expect people to experiment with it. Now we're on to Ice, which got wrecked with this legendary. It's way too ambitious. It's basically only castable if you have the 7, which is just way too much to ask for, especially because it demands light or dark, and those are really difficult to get into the break zone easily. You can probably put a Q deck with it though. You probably will get it off every now and then. I just don't think it will be competitive. Pretty funny though. Really weird that it's in Ice. Chivalry. This card has a crazy ceiling. Indefinite discard hasn't really existed before, unless you count Jilnabat with Hashmail, which I won't. And Icewind happens to have the perfect partner for it, which is Barrel Eye. Probably the most threatening thing about this is how impossible it becomes to correctly beat a Barrel Eye with damage removal. Because normally, the best answer to beat Barrel Eye is to kill him in response to the first activate effect, which isn't that hard for 7k. But having this stacked so that he survives, and then losing your board and discarding the rest of your hand is crippling. So this makes it really hard to kill Barrel Eye with damage effects. And if you play around that by just not using it, not killing the Barrel Eye, then if they don't have the Chivalry, then they just got past your removal effectively for free just because this card exists. So, even besides the fact that it's just really a solid kind of high potential, high ceiling, hand discard, it also creates really annoying situations that are hard to sort of play around correctly without perfect information. As for some other pretty high ceiling targets, are stuff like Lasso, Ophelia, and Cyan. But even outside that, most important is that its base case is still pretty good. It basically functions like a reverse Bellius. And combat tricks is something that Ice couldn't really already do. I mean, we did just get Card Monk, which has seen a bit of play, which is cool. But this, one-ups that for sure. So I do expect to see this card quite a bit. And I think it will be quite threatening, potentially, in Icewind. Don Corneo. It is good, but I will say it's worse than it looks. It is very similar to the 4-cost Thief backup from ages ago, which saw exactly 0 play. However, Ice has much less contested backup slots than Wind, and also the discard plays into other Ice cards. So the problem is it also won't hit your opponent's most relevant card most of the time, which is especially relevant in the early turns when you'd be aiming for a backup usually. So overall, I'm going to cautiously say it's not great, but it is... it's fine, it's decent, there's nothing wrong with playing it. I just don't think it's as good as it looks when you first read it. Onto Wind, Bismarck. This card is really good, in my opinion. You can be super thankful they did remember the once per turn this time. The fact that it fuels itself in your turn makes it super reliable, and Wind already has the best instant speed bounce for your opponent's turn with Althea. So this card is already solid on its own. But in Icewind, in my opinion, it probably gets crazy because Ochu is a ready-made target for the end of turn trigger. You actually gain CP from bouncing that, like quite a bit of CP honestly, and it keeps your Althea open for like Lock or Riku or second Ochus instead of you often having to use it on Ochu to get the cast counts and the activations up. And so this really pushes the Barrel Eye triggers and the lock cast count through the roof potentially. And it even lets you finish things off when Barrel Eye can't, which is relevant when you don't have enough Pandemoniums to respond to their Barrel Eye removal. So overall, I think it's quite a solid card on its own, and also has pretty solid ramifications in Icewind again. So I expect to see quite a bit of this. I also think it would probably be a solid forward in loop, just as a generator, just the extra draw every turn while it's on the field, being able to reuse like Abuse Miyun and White Mage and stuff like that. So yeah, expect to see this card quite a bit. Sin. This is definitely a relevant card. I cannot say for certain how good it is though, because Repeatable Stoller actually looks great on paper, obviously, but I remember what I said about a protection effect, which was a huge part of her power level. 4-cost 8k is a bad place to be, which Sin is, but board clear insurance is very valuable, and it is also one of the ways to prevent a massive cuts go, besides Creature Line. Unfortunately though, most autos that kill a 4-cost 8k efficiently are still efficient if you effectively turn them into your opponent discards 2 cards, which is basically what the action ability does. So in conclusion, I can't confidently say where this card sits. If nothing else, if it does end up existing in the game, then Loop might have to play Exodus. But it'll definitely see play. I don't know how competitive it'll be. It might be really competitive. It might be a bit of a liability. Who knows? But definitely a card to watch out for. Definitely relevant. You have to probably consider its existence. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. Choco Mog. The only reason I bring this up is that Icewind already has its effect readily live with Nono and Chocolate, and one of Icewind's weaknesses usually is lacking removal that doesn't require forward presence already. That being said though, Icewind summon slots are hyper contested, so this might be too situational anyway. I just thought it was worth mentioning. Typhon though, this card came out of nowhere. This is actually, it's basically Death Gaze with no drawbacks and a decent body for some reason. So you can expect to see like at least one of this in basically every win deck. It's very solid overall. Non-breaking removal is really premium, especially at 3-cost. As a side note, it is also the 4th card in the game that can actually increase your deck size at will, and it's in the correct element while being able to target itself. So there are probably Miyun loops that this converts into true infinites, without like taking away the restriction with Miyun loops where you will run out of deck eventually. So that's just a random extra side note. I mean, the card though, as in itself, completely regardless of that, is quite solid. Rosa, another card that could be used in Icewind, although last set I might have claimed it's a bit ambitious. Now with Bismarck on O2, we might just have enough feel for this to function as an easier cast hope, but with a higher ceiling. The protection effect is nice, mainly because Chocolate provides the perfect buffer to avoid wasting the CP if you leave it up. Again though, Icewind is getting hyper contested in deck slots. There's it's already getting very refined in terms of the good cards you can play and the kind of slots that you devote to certain things. So it might still be too ambitious just because it's another payoff card rather than a engine card or a card that helps earlier on before you have any setup. But it is very potent, so it might definitely see play. It might actually be very good. The character, playing a character off top of your deck is super solid naturally. Hitting a summon is would be very sad, but or of course a backup that you already have in play. But it's still very potent. We expect to see it around. We'll see how good it actually is. Well, there's not a lot to say here. It's basically written on the card what it does. I'm sure we've all searched the 7+ cost motive swords and seen the good ones, so I'm not going to go through them all. Yazma is probably the most relevant one. The damage effect is actually a pretty good kicker, but I think the main reason this card exists is a way to turn your Titan Lord of Craigs, which I'll get to in a second, into a bit more. Did I say Titan Lord of Craigs? I meant to say the other guy. What's his name? Montleone. So I'll talk about it anyway when we get to him. Next card, Camarena. This is cute, but the issue, as I've mentioned a few times, is that, in previous videos at least, is that a 3-cost vanilla 9k isn't great. That being said, of the ways to clear your own backups outside their own effects, this is one of the better ones. It's just, I don't know if the body is relevant enough to justify sort of, 1, having to have a lot of earth backups, and 2, just being a vanilla, basically. Titan Lord of Craigs. The most confusing thing about this card is that this is a legend, while Susano is a hero. But this one costs 1 more, it doesn't remove, and it has a way more insane condition to deal the damage. Still though, it is cheaper than Philia, and it doesn't have the damage 6 drawback. However, the most concerning thing is that it doesn't naturally kill 9Ks, which I think is a lot worse than you'd first think from reading it. Obviously, you can with the backup, the primal support backup that goes with it. Although this is the only Earth primal, and so playing that backup is probably taking up valuable backup slots for not a lot of benefit. But of course, if for some reason you need a board clear and you don't want to play Shantoto for whatever reason, or you feel like Shantoto is not enough, then this is an option as another one. I think also maybe they erred on the side of caution because Gabranth is in the same color, although Gabranth is definitely dropping off in like castability. Being a 2-cost 5k these days is much more of a drawback than it was when he was originally around. So yeah, I mean it's not amazing, but it is. It's still a board clear forward, so maybe we'll see. Maybe it'll turn out alright in some decks. Cloud. This is I'm lukewarm about this card. It is kind of like a cheaper, weirder BFA that can't hit dull forwards. Its protection effect is pretty hard because most of the playable category 7 cards imply you'll be playing a different Cloud. So I'm on the fence about this card overall. I will say though, a removal generator is not something Earth usually has, so it might be better in this element than I'm giving it credit for. Instead of considering it as a card in a vacuum, I should probably be thinking about it as a card in its element, and it actually does do something that Earth doesn't usually do. So that's, if anything, something worth considering. But I'm on the fence about whether it will be good enough these days. So we'll see. Jesse can search though, which is cool. This Shantoto, this card is so good, but it has the worst possible name. I mean, that's you can read the card and you can know that straight away. You don't need me to tell you that. It would actually be really good in loop, but even with 3 Althea, it might be too ambitious to risk the name clash alongside the board clear, especially because your opponent can see it in play. So I would like to use this card in something. I would like to make it work in something, but giving up the backup Shantoto is a very, very big thing that shouldn't be taken lightly. So we'll see if that's if that's something worth doing, and if you can make up for it in other ways, like with Titan, for example. But that's basically what there is to say about that. This monk, it is hilarious looking at this alongside Sarah Mobius. But still, any monk with a function is worth a look currently, obviously, because monks are now relevant because Sophie exists. This does have a home in mono monks. I probably don't think it will fit into dual water earth, which I do believe is the superior approach. But still something worth considering. Nice to have just extra fodder lying around with Ursula that could actually do something useful besides be a vanilla. Montleonis, so card I mentioned before. So this is a really interesting card, honestly. It's excellent redundancy for the wall. So in my opinion, of all the things that will maybe make that wall more relevant, is that this card can revive him, and he's a ready-made sort of revive for that. I mean, the wall is actually pretty good anyway. Maybe probably not giving you enough credit, but that aside, it's a bit weak. This card is a bit weak for its stat line. Like being only 7k with no keywords or anything is the fact that it's effectively locked to mono earth hurts it a lot. Though I think it's a bit overcosted to justify reviving Ursula in monks, and I don't think there's any high cost cards you would be able to add to monks to make it a better payoff. But it's a cool card. It's a nice sort of this is the kind of card that's interesting for a mono payoff. This is a nice way to try and push a mono payoff, kind of like Cagnazzo was back in the day. So might be fun to build around, but I don't know if it's going to be competitive. This X-Death. Okay, I actually have a very high opinion of this card. It is a very good combination of effects, especially doing the fact that it's effectively doing 3 things at once, and it is quite efficient. So it's removal, it's generating your backups, and it's also generating your forward presence. So that's the 3 things that it does, which are all doing all 3 of those at once is very solid. It is especially good at destroying like any aggressive start, and it's not locked to lightning forwards, so you can cheat stuff in like Nimbus or whatever key forward that cares about. Its special is also super solid, which allows you to play multiple copies of it in your deck to see it more often without actually hating your life when you see multiples. So overall, I'm quite a fan of this card, although of course it is a large investment, but that's on the basis that the forward you bring out is solid, then that's not actually that big a deal. So pretty decent fan of this. Ravana. So it's funny because they just keep ramping up the lightning multi-damage forwards. So we went from Asthenian to Behemoth K and now to this. But this, however, it has a better protection effect than those. And 4 is a much bigger damage number than 2. But, unfortunately, it costs 6 and you have to actually work for the damage. So I'll be real, I don't expect it to be highly competitive. But I do expect to see some interesting decks and some kind of cheesy finishes with it. So, it'll be fun, it'll be interesting, but I don't think it's going to be competitive enough. This card, on the other hand, this card is good. I am probably a bit less keen on it than I've seen some people. It is obviously excellent with Raid and Revenant Wings. That's been brought up a lot. But that's actually its biggest edge. Outside that, it's basically just a Dramalek and the new Ramu to use with it, which are varying degrees of meh. And overall, that's like a pretty weak or limited summon lineup for 9 of your deck slots, which doesn't really do a lot without this board in play. So that's particularly concerning when he's a hard 5 cost with no inherent protection. But I'm not saying it's bad or unplayable. I expect it to see play, mainly though for the 2-card combo with Revenant Wings. That's most of its benefit, I feel. Dragoon. Just another excellent addition to Dragoons. It might not be top tier, but it exists, and this gives it a second removal stick, which gives it a lot more leeway for its sequence of draws and the things you cast. So just watch out for that. Leviathan, Lord of the Wall. So 9 is a hefty cost, but this is possibly enough value to justify it. Making 3 forwards disappear at once, and possibly a monster as well, is effectively a one-sided board clear, and straight removal is something the Water usually has trouble with on its own. The potential to kill more with Althea as well is just icing on the cake, or other bounce effects, whatever else you have around. But the most exciting thing, in my opinion, is that this is a massive on-color payoff for Arise, as in Lena's special, which is much easier to resolve now that we have 2 Lenas. So you can have 6 copies of Lena. You can actually do Arise quite easily if you want to. So we finally have a massive payoff on her element. You used to have to splash off color cards, and even then there were no options that were really, really good. But this one might actually be up there. Now, Golbers. This is another super random card out of nowhere. I don't actually really like high roll cards like this, so it's hard to talk, existing in the game at least. So it's kind of hard to talk about and evaluate because it's either awful or amazing, and you can't really control which one of those it is. It just depends what you hit. But if nothing else, it is fun. The action ability is actually very interesting as sort of the first non-conditional steal effect while being appropriately heftily costed. I'd much prefer an extreme cost like this that rewards kind of smart deck building and board manipulation rather than brainless straight CP, so props to them for that. So cool card, interesting, but again, I'm not a fan of cards like this existing, so hopefully it's not actually competitive or around a lot. We'll see. Jekt. What I really want to mention about this card is that insane special ability. That is one of those specials where it might actually be feasible to run lots of copies of Jekt just so you basically have it in your hand whenever you want it. Obviously the hard part is getting this card into play efficiently. It's probably difficult to get the break in a water deck, although it is a similar condition to Yuna, and she's one of the best generic water cards already, so there might be something there. It is hard to tell without building a playing around, but yeah, I just want to stress that special ability is pretty nuts. It stops anything, including multiple things that happen at once. So even something like Agrius, when she enters, neg 7k and draw a card, you stop both of those with this. So yeah, do not, respect that special. Lakshmi, Lady of Bliss. I honestly think this card is quite good. Unconditional draw every turn is obviously powerful. The body is cheaper than you'd expect for that kind of effect. But the more important though probably is the fact that it's a primal, and so the other water primal is good as well, which means that the backup that makes them cheaper is probably relevant. It's probably actually relevant. There's a reason to include it in your deck when you've got 2 cards that benefit off it. 1 neutral, 1 removal. What is annoying let me say this. That thing though is annoying in my opinion from a gameplay standpoint, because I'm not a fan of the design of Harley-like cards where they're unsearchable, but they make a noticeable difference if you draw them in the correct predetermined order. But that is what it is. At least there's something to do with the primal support backups. Luzaf is really cool design. It's like a more interactive, higher ceiling Chocobo, and this is probably the first self bounce that actually works as efficient protection for one of your forwards. There's not a lot else to say except that you probably either get blown out at some point or forced into some weird play around lines because of this card. So I like it. Again, first sort of real relevant, like efficient protection via self bounce that we have. So yeah, it's gonna be pretty fun to see what happens with that card. Onto Light and Dark. Okay, so this Shinryu is another hard card to evaluate because it really depends on what ends up being popular. But at the very least, it is a solace when samurais exist. I'm a big unfan of the randomness on the second ability. It feels very Hearthstone-y, where like an entire game could basically be decided by a coin flip. 95% of the time, the draw 2 is just way better. I do hope they don't make a habit out of designing effects like this. Also in particular, if both people are playing Shinryu, I hate the idea that one person can just randomly hit the draw 2 and the other person unfortunately hits this 7k, and that decides the game as well. But again, that is what it is. The card hard to figure out if it'll be good or not at the moment, but definitely being able to kill samurais is a nice original use for it. A Marshari. This is generic summon reduction, cost reduction, which is actually that's pretty potent. It's also got a very good set of effect options. Those three together as options is actually very solid. So this is exactly the kind of support that summon heavy decks need to kind of offset the drawback of having trouble generating board presence. This is going to sound a little bit counterintuitive, but I actually think this card is probably good in an Ifrita fire deck because it makes both the Ifritas cheaper, and also gives you a second use for filling your break zone with random summons once you either don't need them, have an excess of them, or run out of the 3 cost, which actually gets the payoff for having lots. So even outside that, just in general, any decks that play a lot of summons probably benefit quite a lot from this card. So that's one to keep in mind. Omega. This is another difficult card to evaluate. 10k is solid, and it modulates its effect correctly. The counters modulate correctly because it's vulnerable in your turn, not theirs. So it's it's harder to kill things in your opponent's turn than it is to kill them in your own turn. Unfortunately, though, it is a 5-cost vanilla and it's dark. So there will definitely be games where it will checkmate your opponent. But probably the biggest point against it is, of course, Sophie, who basically does the same thing but without either of the massive drawbacks. But I do expect to see it a little bit. I do expect to have games effectively stolen by it. So interesting, maybe a bit too hefty of a drawback to be properly highly competitive, but something to watch out for sure. Stern Leonis, oh boy, generic forward cost reduction. So first up, I will say that that's actually just a really cool generic card. Light and Dark have become pretty hard to justify recently due to multi-element cards being basically as good or better than them without the massive drawback of not being able to be discarded. So this is the right approach to take, like a universally relevant effect that isn't available anywhere else, besides Tilica, obviously. The effect options it has, they're much worse than Majori, but that is appropriate because the other effect is obviously much more universal. However, the effects are still pretty good. Like, there's still a decent set of effects. With that out of the way, though, I have to mention how relevant this is in the world of loops. So we can now globally reduce forwards by 2 instead of 1. Being dark is definitely a relevant drawback in that area. I'm very unsure that the potential benefits would outweigh that in a regular loop specifically, since this doesn't really appear to help in most situations that aren't already a cycle loop, which turns into a real loop. However, this definitely opens up a lot of other more forward-heavy loops, particularly ones involving stuff like Titus Miyun or like Lakeisha Zoo. There are almost too many possibilities to list here. It's unlikely, because Riku Loop is so good and so solid, it is unlikely there'll be a more competitive loop than that, but it is fun to explore anyway. This card opens up quite a lot for that, so yeah, that's something I'll be messing around with quite a bit, but even just as a generic card, it's actually pretty cool. I like it quite a bit. Alcid, we're on to multi-elements. So this is a good card, and you will play it in your Ice Lightning deck. However, the challenge is making an Ice Lightning deck that's actually worth playing. This card doesn't actually solve any of its problems. It just does the same things more efficiently. It does open up the chance to cheat in powerful off-color multi-units, like multi-elements, like Nimbus and Celestia. So, definitely will be played in decks that can support it, but whether you can find a deck good enough for it, that's the real question. This card, however, is a very good step in the right direction. So this card is crazy good. It's really solid step to make Ice Lightning playable. One of the solaces against Nimbus was the fact that it's unlikely to hit your first backup immediately due to its restriction. Zero Mist does not have that restriction. In addition to that, well, so that basically means that it can be quite punishing to a bad start, like very punishing to a bad start even. In addition to that, it also gets an additional freeze on entry at damage 3, which means it gets meaningfully better later on in the game as well. All of that would already be good enough, but it also has a relevant bonus effect that basically does what Snow used to do with no cost, restriction, or effort. So this card is very, very good. I expect to see it a lot initially, and also after that, if it finds a good home. So that's the main thing here. Varn looks good on paper, pretty good on paper, but of course it's hampered by an awful set of options for its search. The most feasible set's probably Fran back up with the new Jote and Mjörn, maybe Elza as a forward, and possibly Balthier for some redundancy. Obviously that's not a target for Varn himself, but it will give you something to do with the Elzas or whatever that you have lying around. I think the deck building cost is probably too high for it to be truly competitive, but it is one to keep an eye on as more Sky Pirates get released. Parish, this is a bit expensive and awkward, but it does have some potential. Cell to Use hasn't really been played even in decks that can easily support it, so that's not a point in its favour. However, Parish has a much better body, and it can also hit backups, which in particular, Tyro and Nostalin, maybe even the new Shantoto if you find a way to justify it over the board wipe. This is also worth a try and loop, but it's probably too expensive and random. Gesho. It looks overcosted, but it's actually a very powerful neutral effect, and Lightning in particular lacks those. I don't know how to describe, but the one interesting thing about it, and I can't really describe this elegantly, but it's basically the first way to straight take a card out of your opponent's deck that they can't really play around. So before now, the only way to really do that was either randomly hit it in damage or use a combination of like Sedain and Break Zone removal. Otherwise, if they had a card that they particularly wanted to, have available in their deck and they've drawn it, then they can just keep it in their hand and you can't get to it with Break Zone removal. Also, the fact that this guy's a ninja is also cute in case Edge becomes relevant again. But yeah, main thing, it's a very relevant, good neutral effect in an element combination that probably has trouble with those usually. I mean, not the fire part, obviously. I've already talked about how crazy some of the fire neutrals are now, but Lightning definitely has a hard time with that. And Cloud of Darkness. So this is actually way easier to free cast than it looks. Keeping in mind that your draws for turn count towards the first condition, so you only need to draw one card and have your opponent discard one card, and that's actually pretty easy in this combination. Obviously that's something that, those are the two things these elements do quite a bit of. Probably the most elegant way is Nicol and Ultimecia, although there is plenty of competitive ways to draw cards like Kuchulain, Yuna, Ash, Physalis, and go with any of Ice's decent discard cards. There's even cute things like stuff like Realm into Flan and Whale Zombie or Adamantoise and Lancing in it. You got the Bard backup from Opus 12 that draws when you make your opponent discard. Even Icewind can actually get this to 0 with things like Lock and Chocolate. It might not be the biggest payoff, but it is nice, but not that much effort. So I like it. It's cool. But yeah, that's basically everything, I think. Yeah, so that's all the cards I just want to talk about initially. I might do some more in-depth stuff later on if that's what people want. Thank you for listening. Good luck. Happy building. Cheers.